The title of our talk today is International Tech in a Geopolitical Context. Our speaker, Sam Olsen, is the Chief Analyst at the strategic risk consultancy Sibylline and a seasoned geopolitical expert. His research has been widely published and focuses on great power relations and the changing world order. A specialist on China, he lived in Asia for a decade and was a legislative fellow on Chinese trade in the US Senate. A graduate of Oxford University and the Cass Business School, he also served as an intelligence officer in the British Army. Sam is passionate about using data and technology to provide insights into the biggest geopolitical issues of our time. With that, Sam Olsen, please begin.
Thanks very much, Len, and it's a real honor to be here. I've really enjoyed a lot of or all of the Mackinder Forum presentations. And I'm especially pleased to see Rob here, Rob Atkinson. The ITIF work that he does is fantastic, and I've learned a lot. And the reason I'm so interested in it is because over my career, especially in the last sort of 15, 20 years, I've become to realize just how important technology is to geopolitical, especially great power relations. And what I'm going to do today is to discuss a lot of my thinking, which has crystallized into this presentation. I can't include everything, all my thoughts. So in the Q&A, if people do have some sort of related questions around tech, I'd be delighted to sort of try and be a bit more inclusive of some of the other thinking around this. But let's just get started and talk a little bit about some of the background, if this works. Okay, so the first thing to do is to talk about China's technology strategy. So I lived and worked in Asia for a long time, and I was the global head of IP protection for a company called Kroll about 10, 15 years ago. And I spent a lot of time working in China, looking at Chinese technology and industrial strategy, trying to stop my clients having their IP stolen/borrowed by the Chinese. And I became quite obsessed with trying to understand China's tech/industrial strategy. And not least because this was something which I looked at quite a lot when I was working in the US Senate for Senator Arlen Specter. And things have changed dramatically over the last 15 years in terms of the actualities of China's tech strategy, but the big picture remains the same. And if I could crystallize it, all the different elements, whether it is borrowing/stealing IP, whether it is investing heavily in dual use technologies, whether it is investing heavily in the overall science and tech base, which has now got, for example, 800 public laboratories in the country, and which has seen hundreds of billions of dollars be put into science and tech, which has seen their universities so successful that in the last Nature magazine ranking of the top 50 up and coming technology and research universities, 50 out of 50 were Chinese. And in the top 10 of all universities, I can't remember the exact figure, 7 or 8 are now Chinese. The tech strategy and the size of the tech strategy, I should be more accurate in saying, is really doing well. And this is because the overall strategy I think, for the whole country, for the CCP, can be boiled down into winning the fourth industrial revolution. That is quite a claim, but it is based on years and years of analysis of what China's doing, but perhaps more importantly, understanding what China is saying internally. And there are so many different think tank papers and government papers talking about the fourth industrial revolution and the importance of its different elements into creating economic and political power for the country. And just a tiny aside, if one looks at the overall hierarchy of security within China, political security is the number one out of the 16 different elements of security that are noted, and economic power and military power are both the numbers 2 and 3, sort of just below the top one. And both of those, economic and political security, sorry, economic and military security, are both absolutely fundamentally part of their fourth industrial revolution's plans. And so, if one accepts that the fourth industrial revolution winning that is important, the question is why? And I mentioned about the security element, but in the broader picture, history is phenomenally important for the CCP. And it has been, actually, if you go through all the different dynasties of China, for the last 2,500 years, they have always had court historians. And one of the first things that any dynasty coming in has done is to rewrite the history of the previous dynasty to give legitimacy to the current dynasty. And that is exactly what the CCP have done. I personally think of the CCP as just a new dynasty in the 4,000-ish years of Chinese history. And they act very much in the same way as their predecessors. And history, when it comes to political power, is now looked at internationally rather than just domestically. And there are many, many papers which look at how Britain in the 1700s and the 1800s became the global dominant power, and how America followed suit in the last 100 or so years. And the key lesson that is learned, and the key lesson which is repeated time and time again in government and think tank documents, but also just talking to Chinese scholars, Chinese government people, is the fact that Britain and America both won their respective industrial revolutions, the first, the second, and the third. And that gave those countries not only enormous economic power, but then they could use that to create political power domestically and internationally, and rewrite the global order to suit them, and therefore to help promote their longevity at the top. And that very much suits China and its other ambitions to be a/the global power by 2049, although of course they want to do it sooner than that. So if I could boil it down, the 2049 plan is the big picture aim, and the winning the fourth industrial revolution is the strategy on how to reach that aim. And China has looked at, as I already said, a lot about how to invest in critical technologies, and I'll come on to some of the stats on that in the coming slides. But 2 points I want to raise right now are: one is what we call techno-econ influence. And I specialize, and my team specializes in writing very complex quantitative and qualitative models to help understand geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. And one of the big models that I wrote is called the influence model, which uses huge amounts of data, hundreds of thousands and even millions in the bigger parts of this, of metrics and data points to be able to look at how country A influences country B. And we do a lot of work on Chinese influence around the world, and my models have been used by the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, etc. And a clear element of that is that China's influence is rooted specifically and particularly through technological and economic influence. What that means is that China is now, on the economic side, the biggest trade partner for 120, 130-ish countries. And the economic power, the supply chain is really important as well. And we kind of know that quite well. But the technological side is really important, and China providing the digital infrastructure to most of the world outside of the West is something that should not be ignored, because that gives China huge influence, not only what they're doing now and their telecommunications, etc., but as and when their economies get built on digital backbone, the fact that China is running that digital backbone, whether it's the economic element of trade or the economic element of transport or education or healthcare, all these elements get built on what China wants them to do. And remember that tech is not values free. Technology is embedded with the values of the country that makes that tech. And a really good way of looking at that is looking at AI. And by the way, AI is absolutely fundamental to the fourth industrial revolution. Again, we'll come on to that in a second. But if you just to prove the point that technology is values laden, look at DeepSeek and the fact that if you ask DeepSeek about Tiananmen Square, it will not tell you, because the values that it has reflect the Chinese Communist Party's values and viewpoints on Tiananmen Square and other elements. that might be considered incendiary to the CCP. So if the whole world, minus the West, is using Chinese tech, that obviously is very useful for infusing Chinese values there as well. So you can see, hopefully, that the Chinese technology strategy is not just tech on its own, but it's Chinese technology strategy as a way to fulfill its other political, military, and economic ambitions. And the final bit there is AI 2027 paper in Taiwan. This, if any of you have not read it, is one of the most important papers I think has been written for years. Not everyone agrees with it, but the fact that it is stimulating debate is really vital. AI 2027 was written by American researchers recently, and what it showed was the progression of AI from where we are now into the next stage, which is artificial general intelligence, and then from there into artificial superintelligence. The definition of artificial general intelligence, of course, is to beat the Turing test, which is to convince the person that they're not talking to a computer but to a human. And the definition, as put forward by Nick Bostrom, one of the professors that really came up with a lot of the philosophical underpinnings of artificial superintelligence (ASI), is that ASI is cleverer in inverted commas than the whole of humanity put together. And if we go back to China winning the fourth industrial revolution, we know from the Chinese side and from the Western side that whoever wins the AI race is going to be absolutely on pole position to win the overall fourth industrial revolution. That whichever side wins the ASI race is going to cement for potentially centuries to come their dominance in the economic, therefore the political and military space, especially if that winning means that you actually become the country to lead in the ASI race. And this is important for what we're about to talk about because this AI 2027 paper shows that we are potentially within a few years, maybe 3 to 4 years, of ASR, artificial superintelligence, becoming a thing. And in fact, 2027 refers to the year where AI supercoders, in other words, the progression halfway house between AGI, artificial general intelligence, and ASI, is the use of AGI to create code that will create ASI in the end. And at that point, whichever side wins the supercoder, as it's called, race, will be well on the way, and again in prime position to win the ASI race overall. The problem for America and the West is that the American push into ASI is reliant on Taiwan. America cannot win the ASI race without Taiwanese chips. And if you're sitting there in China and you know that your overall strategy is to win the fourth industrial revolution, and that in turn depends on winning the AI race, and that in turn depends on becoming the first country to get to AGI supercoders and ASI, winning the ASI race, and that you know that your main competitor relies on Taiwan, which is only 100 miles away, and which is already in the crosshairs for other reasons, that does bring very strongly into contention a desire by China to definitely go heavy on its Taiwanese ambitions, and before America can get to the ASI goalposts. So that is something which is really important and what I'll be riffing on for the rest of the presentation. So next up, US's tech strategy. We all know, even if you don't have the figures to hand, how important US tech is to the overall country's welfare. Something like, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's 40% of the current stock market value is from tech companies. And you've got the Magic Seven or the Big Seven or whatever you want to call them, Nvidia, Google, Alphabet, etc., as being at the forefront, but they're not the only ones. By far, they're not the only ones. There are loads and loads of amazing technology companies in America who are earning lots of money, both home and both domestically and abroad. But what they mostly have in common is their reliance on China. And Apple saying designed in California, made in China. That is the same for huge amounts of American tech, whether it's not made in China perhaps, but it's made in Taiwan. The issue is that we only look generally at the chips themselves, But actually, an awful lot, a huge amount of the overall technology supply chain that America uses in its factories and in its products actually comes from China itself. And that doesn't necessarily mean things that you would have heard of, but it's things like the powertrains and the general transistors and other materials that come from China. And I'm not even talking about the raw materials. For example, 98% of graphite come from China, processed graphite come from China. 45% plus of all refined copper. America only refines about 3% of the world's copper. So it's a massive difference there. And if we go into the overall manufacturing, remember that China now manufactures more than America, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Australia, and Canada all combined. The lead that China has on manufacture is insurmountable in the short term. And what's more, an awful lot of the stuff that they do, especially for the technology industry, is replicable, I can't get my words out, replicable in America, at least in the short term, simply because the skills either have been lost or they just haven't been learnt yet because it's very brand new technologies. So America, to give the last administration its credit, has tried to step up to the mark. And they've introduced the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act to try and make sure that they are able to wean themselves off Chinese reliance. Is that enough? Well, we shall see. But one of the most important things is trying to understand whether the current administration is really putting its back into a lot of the de-risking motions that the previous administration was. And I would say that the jury's still out overall. There have been some very good things. I was particularly impressed by Trump rescinding the AI Diffusion Act when it comes to the Middle East, because one of the most important elements, if we look at China's technology strategy, is to diffuse Chinese tech as many places as possible, not just to diffuse the economic side, but also, as I mentioned, about the values and the political elements that brings in. And if America was not going to allow its chips to be used in the Middle East, then the gap would have been filled by Chinese chips, whether they're good or not. The fact is that now they can use American chips, and Middle East will almost certainly build an awful lot of its infrastructure to do with AI and other advanced technologies using American chips, which stops the Middle East definitely falling into the Chinese technological sphere, which is great. But other elements that and the Trump administration are doing aren't so clear, and I think that we would all benefit in the West, especially those of us who want America and the West to beat China in the fourth industrial revolution race, to be a bit clearer and a bit more perhaps aggressive, maybe the wrong word, but assertive in pushing back on China and their tech strategy. Europe. Europe's screwed. It comes to tech. And I don't actually include the UK. The UK is doing lots and lots of good stuff, but Europe itself has got some very good companies when it comes to the chip manufacturing machines, for example, SML in the Netherlands, and there's a few other good companies, for example, in Switzerland and Germany. But that is the limit. The European regulators have really made it difficult for tech companies to grow, and not least because the capital markets is so dysfunctional. And actually trying to find a good exit for a tech entrepreneur in the capital markets is incredibly difficult. And that's why so many people just leave and go to the US. At least in the UK, we are definitely by some margin the number one company in the country in the world outside of China and America when it comes to advanced technologies, especially AI. And not least because of our regulations are much more American in style than European in style, and are aimed at improving UK's technological resilience on the world stage. It isn't in the same league as China or America. That's why I would say that great power relations when it comes to geotechnology are a matter between America and China. But the UK is showing the lead when it comes to mid-power countries. It just needs to do a lot more. But France, Germany, Australia, etc., could follow the UK to at least get into a better position. And the National AI Strategy of the UK, it might not be as good as it could have been, but it was an awful lot better than it could than I personally feared it would be. And it addresses things like compute, things which are really important for AI, but perhaps go under the radar. So again, a lot more work to do, but in a better position than we could have been. The International Digital Strategy for Europe, a quick note on that. That isn't going to work because of all the reasons I just said, that Europe is basically dysfunctional and there's still 27 different countries working on their own rather than as a European whole. So I'm very pessimistic about Europe being able to rise to the challenge of meeting America or China in the great power competition for geotechnology. Great power techno-nationalism. There is a brilliant book called Techno-Nationalism by a man called Alex Capri in Singapore. Some of you may know him. And these are some of his points, and I would agree wholeheartedly with them. But great power techno-nationalism, one second, is really characterized by weaponization of supply chains. We've seen that especially since COVID, and in the trade war, especially again since April this year. And that ain't going anywhere anytime soon. We also see the strategic decoupling of supply chains. I mentioned that briefly with America's attempts, CHIPS and IRA, but bear in mind that is just following what China's been doing for quite a few years now, especially on dual circulation, which many would have heard of. And that announcement, which is what, 5, 6 years old now, was specifically designed to reduce the overall exposure of China to the West, particularly America, and especially when it comes to technology and supply chains. So this is something which is happening, and again, is not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Reshoring strategic industries is obviously related to that, and innovation mercantilism. And this, again, one of the first people I heard speaking about this was Rob Atkinson, is on the call. So again, kudos to you. But this is something that I saw firsthand. I call it a different name then, but when I was working at Kroll and also when I was working in the American Senate, because it's clear that for the last 20, 25 years at least, China has been party to innovation mercantilism, which is destroying your opponent's ability to innovate. And the classic example is solar panels in the early 2000s. The US, Japan, and Germany were the leaders, and China systematically took apart their ability to create and compete in solar panel industry, first of all by borrowing, in inverted commas, their IP and then using that IP to sow the seeds for their own industry, and then creating huge subsidiaries which are counter to WTO laws to boost their own solar panel manufacturing capacity and then use that to destroy, by undercutting the competition, the ability for the US, Japan, and Germany to compete. And now, basically, the only place that does solar panels, in effect, is China. That is innovation mercantilism in action. And I could go on for literally hours, maybe dozens of hours, on my own experiences in looking at where China has undercut the innovative capacity for other countries, sector by sector. And then finally, trade diplomacy is pretty obvious. But these are all taken, as I said, from Alex Capri's book. Do read it, it's very good. So, this is an interesting slide, especially since many of the people here are living or in America or are American themselves. In Europe, and this is actually the title, "The Threat from US Tech," is taken from a presentation that I was asked to give to a bunch of private sector CSOs, Chief Security Officers, who about a couple of months ago were very worried that America was going to actually start cutting them off from American tech. And what we went through with loads of case studies and things. Personally, I think the threat is slightly overstated, but it's worth going through what other people are thinking about. First of all, is the attitude to tech. There are lots of people who believe in the United States that Europe is putting up unnecessary barriers to the expansion of American technology. Now, I can see it from both sides. I understand that actually, for example, 70% of all the cloud computing in Europe is from American companies. And if you want to create sovereign capabilities in technology, because you recognize that technology is the future, for example, the fourth industrial revolution, then it makes no sense for countries that aspire to be, in inverted commas, great powers, or at least pretty good powers, to not have at least some of their own technological sovereign capabilities. And when you've got such American dominance in cloud and other elements, it makes sense to say, okay, well, how do we push back on that? And then I also understand from the American point of view, saying to Europe, why are you trying to do this? I mean, we are your pals. Yes, we make money from it, but we're giving you something which you can't really do yourself, and you'd just be just shooting yourself in the foot if you're going to try and sort of stop American companies providing cloud and give something European as a solution, which doesn't work so well and is more expensive. So both sides have got very much right on their side. It just depends on which side you want to look at. But if Europe does want to decouple from the United States, it is pretty hard to do so. And also, it also is very hard to do so when you've got the threat of Trump's tariffs overlooking you. And a lot of European attitudes to American tech have been somewhat watered down in the face of specific Trump administration threats over tariffs and maintaining access for American tech companies. So we know this is all linked together. The final point is kill switches. Again, this is a point which is bandied around in Europe a lot. Can America turn Europe off? Does America have kill switches? And the answer is, of course, in some cases, yes. But the way that American firms have operated in kill switches has been very much more in the open air. And Maxar in Ukraine, they gave warning to Ukraine that they were going to turn things off. It wasn't done in a way to force Ukraine back to the table. It wasn't done in a way which was aimed at destroying Ukrainians' attempts to push back on Russia. It was done in a not particularly nice way, but at least it was done in an even-handed and obvious way. And I think that is something that the US, whatever people in Europe, but especially people in China say, is that I'm still a massive optimist on the Americans generally, almost certainly doing the right thing at the end of the day, even if it might not be to people's liking. But the process is very important, and I don't see much evidence of that changing, which is great. Um, and to be honest, what I expect someone who used to work there and loves America a lot. But that isn't to say that things can't change. And the tariffs were a wake-up call to men in Europe to say that, look, America isn't just our perfect friend who's never going to do anything against us. America's got its own interests, and where they differ, America will always put itself first. Fair enough. But the trick is to make sure that we realize that there's an awful lot of things happening which we should be doing together. And as that continues, I think that the likelihood for decoupling and the likelihood for kill switches or other nefarious activities brought by the Americans onto the Europeans will be diminished. As to saying about kill switches and the Chinese, that is a whole different matter, and I'll leave it to your imagination as to what might happen if there was a fight with China and the American tech industry slash government's reactions there. Talking of China, the threat from Chinese tech, and if you look, I'll just make it moving out of the way. Sorry, just making sure we can see this. If you look at this slide, sorry, the diagram on the right, you can see I put that there to show the actual dominance of Huawei against its two biggest competitors, which happen to be European Nokia and Ericsson when it comes to 5G and other digital infrastructure. We know, I've written extensively about this, I've interviewed people, I have spent a lot of time on the subject, that Nortel, the Canadian company, which was one of the biggest technology companies in North America, was ripped apart because of China and Huawei. We also know that Huawei, even though it had pretty dodgy roots, is now an amazingly effective company. It invests huge amounts in its R&D, and it works well. Yes, it is supported by a massive line of credit, potentially between 60 billion and 100 billion dollars from the Chinese government. The figures change all the time, so it's hard to put an exact number on it. But we know that when Brazil buys $16 billion worth of Huawei equipment at a 1% interest rate, that is a pretty sweet deal, and not many people could match that. But we also know that Huawei's not sat on its laurels and has invested heavily in R&D and is now creating stuff which actually is game changing and is very, very market leading. And so it is not right to say that China is not able to innovate. It is not right to say that China cannot lead the world in many different technologies. And if you go back a few slides here, you see the tech strategy there. That map, I didn't talk about it, but you probably all seen that before, is where Huawei is in the world. And not particularly in Western Europe, but it is almost everywhere else. And that's because Huawei is cheap and it is effective. And if you go back to this, we know that Chinese innovation mercantilism is an issue. We know that Chinese dominance of its tech companies by being cheaper and more effective, especially in those parts of the world which want to prioritize a low price, is very effective. We also know that China is trying to make sure that its standards become the global default, which gives it massive advantages. And the Made in China 2025, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, was important to that, but it goes beyond that. There are different elements. I counted where I was doing some research in Southeast Asia, 6 different initiatives, Made in China 2025 just being one of those, where China was trying to push its standards into becoming the number one default setting in Southeast Asia. And so there are many ways that what China wants to do that. Two is obviously advantages, and I'll give you a quick one now. Beidou is the Chinese equivalent of GPS, the global positioning system, the satellite system. And it actually works. Beidou works really well. A lot of the tests show it works even better than GPS at many levels. But what Beidou is it's China only made. And so when Pakistan, which is one of America's oldest allies officially in Asia, even though they don't often appear like that, but on paper they are, when Pakistan under Imran Khan a few years ago decided to adopt Beidou for its military rather than GPS, that meant that now all of all of Pakistan's advanced weaponry has to abide by Chinese standards around Beidou, which then gives Chinese standards across the weaponry platforms much more of a head start, which basically means now that the Chinese military, in much of its advanced weaponry, especially that requires GPS, well, not GPS, global positioning satellite systems, but in this case, Beidou, is Chinese by default because no one else makes Chinese equipment at that level. And this gives China a default control over the Pakistani armed forces, especially if they want to do anything that's remotely advanced. That's why adopting Chinese standards is very damaging potentially for the West and can interrupt Western relations. So, from a UK point of view, I thought it might be interesting to see what can we do about it. I've already mentioned a lot of this, but basically, if we want to stay in Europe in the middle tier companies, and I include Japan in this, and I include South Korea in this, if we want to sort of decouple from China, and we also don't want to put all our eggs in the American basket, there's not that much actually that we can do without really coming together and trying to create a mid-tier alliance, a coalition of the willing, an AUKUS style arrangement, a NATO for tech, which doesn't include America, lots of things, lots of ideas, but it is very difficult. And at the end of the day, I think that we have to assume that it won't be anytime soon that Europe can really start replicating what it needs to from an America to divorce itself from American or Chinese tech, and so it will be stuck in inverted commas with American tech most likely in the short term. But the important thing is that there is also a huge reliance for the reasons I mentioned on Chinese tech, especially at the industrial level. And so if you look at the technological industrial base, the TIB, that still relies both for America and for Europe on the Chinese on China. And I think that is something which China knows, which is why Europe has got difficulties. I acknowledge that, and it's going to have to do a lot of work to wean itself off China and also American tech if it wants to. But the US has massive difficulties as well. And my strong concern is that until the US really gets its act together to build out its technological industrial base, which is far more than just building some new chips that in Arizona, like TSMC or whatever, but it's involves building out huge ecosystems in semiconductors, but in other technologies as well. But more prosaically, things like making sure they can refine graphite, making sure it can refine copper, making sure it can refine other things that are needed for the defense, sorry, for the technological industrial base. And actually, this is where Europe and the other allies like Japan come into play. Because if America wants to wean itself off the Chinese technological and industrial base, it could do it by itself, but be very hard, very expensive. And there are lots of allies that want to be able to do things together. So, i in summary, I think that yes, there are benefits. Sorry, yes, there are dangers for Europe by being in bed with America too much on tech. Yes, there are dangers for America by being too overly dependent on the Chinese industrial base. So let's try and work out, and maybe I'm being too optimistic here, but I think it's incumbent on all of us to think of ways where the Western alliance can work together to reduce its overall dependency on China. But at the same time, I would call for America to recognize that Europe doesn't want to just allow its own technology base to be completely destroyed or dominated by America, and that a healthy coexistence is probably the best way forward. And if that can be an agreement reached by both sides, I do foresee a very healthy partnership across the Atlantic in the years to come. If both sides don't work together, then I just see China continuing its technological dominance and taking both sides of the Atlantic out and winning the fourth industrial revolution. And at the end of the day, embedding in all of the political, military, and economic benefits that China wants to accrue by winning the fourth industrial revolution. And that's why economic, techno-industrial competition at the great power level is such an important topic for us to understand.